so curious about the perspective of someone in your profession that thinks about beauty a lot, that thinks about cities a lot, who worked you said you worked in a Louis Kahn building, and the designer of the Salk Institute, what some people anyway, and I think is one of the most beautiful buildings in our region. What are some of your impressions of this area, coming from the East Coast to here, in terms of the experience of living here?
It's a huge privilege to be here in Balboa Park and to be here in San Diego. I actually grew up outside of, I grew up in Southern California, but in Claremont, the other Claremont, with Claremont colleges, and that's really, talk about a master planned community of colleges where these, in the 19th century, these Congregationalists came and decided they wanted to found institutions of higher learning that looked just like the East Coast institutions that they were emulating. So much so that when I was growing up, the campuses in Claremont were filled with movie sets and things, because it was cheaper and better to film an East Coast story at the Claremont College's campuses than go back east to Boston or Harvard. So when I went to work every day in one of the most gorgeous buildings ever, beautiful being the word, Louis Kahn's Yale Center for British Art, his last building, Salk Institute, has a lot of the same things that the British Art Center has: concrete, the beautifully toned wood, and great British paintings, Turners, Constables, more than any other outside of Great Britain. It was a fantastic feeling. But what happens here in San Diego is that you move through the landscape and you have to think about nature, even if it's only to think about it as something that's in peril. But within, my ride from the community that raped the landscape up in North County down to the part of the park that I work in, and the ability to walk outside and go to the zoo and see one of the great horticultural spots of the world. I mean, it really is as much a horticultural zoo as it is an animal zoo, and we don't think about it that way. So from the museum perspective, I think we need to stop thinking about museums as purely interior spaces, but really objects contribute to how we can understand nature. And it's not simply that dialogue of the white cube with the objects that are outside of any context. We have to think about the alley and what's going on in the alley, and how to bring that into the room with the Giorgione, and then take it out into the zoo and think about the green and the Giorgione that you've seen, one of the great masterpieces of the Western art tradition. And then you go out to the zoo and you look at the different greens and in the weeds that aren't horticulturally trimmed. So I would agree that it's not just, beauty isn't just about objects, but objects do help us understand the past. And we can't just forget about the past and only be in the present.
Jim, you're sort of the instigator of this discussion in a way, and when I was asked to moderate, a lot of thoughts went through my head immediately. What is beauty? Is this absurd to talk about beauty? One person thinks Frank Gehry buildings are beautiful, another thinks Balboa Park is beautiful, and I feel in one way that this is almost like trying to, stick a fork in an invisible molecule or something. Is there something that we've completely missed here that you would like to interject?
Well, I don't want to stick a fork in it, absolutely. But the one thing that I would like to say about the museum in Balboa Park is that I know for the last 30 years people worried about the encroachment of the city on the park. I think we should reverse the thing and have this park encroach on the city. I think being human, you have sort of the pathos of people die and they get sick and things go wrong, and so there is a sadness in it, but there's also a joy. You have a cup of coffee in the morning, or you have a friend, and I look at beauty as sort of the edge between the two.
This conversation develops, the more obvious it is that again, we need to open up, of course, the meaning, of these words. part of the problem it has been that we continue to think about things in terms of in singularities, and we are understanding that whether it's a park or whether it is in many other environments, they are made of a variety of things, you know, and that it is the ultimate relational kind of complexity of these things operating that constructs this very ephemeral, you know, elusive concept of beauty. And so, but yet as a society, we continue to focus on the aesthetic for aesthetic's sake, sort of all magically concentrating this object from which we continue to be separated. And so I'm thinking that that's part of the problem, is how to begin to speak about the aesthetic in its relational dimension, in a sense. I'm thinking now that more than ever we begin to talk about the ecological dimension, and I don't know who said that in order to really speak of the ecological, we also needed to really complicate it, that it was not enough to talk about the ecology of the bicycle in terms of the functional relationship of the bicycle's parts at this moment, but we now had to ask more than ever, who produced that bicycle, you know, where, and what is its cultural application? It's a very different thing for a bicycle in China to Rotterdam to California. So I think that level of complexity beyond the domains that have really defined a way of thinking is part of what we're talking about here. I mean, I'm thinking when we designed the first, talking about the convention center, building for the convention center, everybody was enamored with the metaphor of the boat with sails on the top of this building, and maybe a beautiful building, but ultimately it ended up blocking the bay. And so, I mean, we continue to talk about the metaphorical in such one-dimensional ways. I'm interested in a more functional, you know, translation of the metaphorical, when instead of having blocked the bay, this building should have really been a pier building, allowing access. So the aesthetic is not a thing, it's a relation.